Let's get started then. Thanks, Eric. So, hello everyone. My name is Alessio Ciullo, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar organized by the Risk and Modeling and Insurance Work Group. I'm co-chairing the work group together with Jana Silman from Cicero, and I will post a few links in the chat regarding our activities and what we are, who we are, what we intend to do, what's our scope. But in a nutshell, it's a recently established group, and what we aim to do is to build a community around the topics of modeling and insurance applied to the NatCat domain, and a community of practitioners and academics. We are currently busy with the organization of this series of webinars, as well as of a workshop that will likely take place at the end of this year or early next year. So today we have the pleasure to host Professor David Bresch from ETH Zurich and Matthew Swiss. David will talk about the interoperability imperative in socioeconomics impact assessments. So Professor David Bresch is Professor of Weather and Climate Risk at ETH Zurich and Matthew Swiss since 2016. Before 2016, he had various roles at Swiss Re, including Head Business Development, Global Head Sustainability, and Head of Atmospheric Perils Group, and Chief Modeler for Natural Catastrophe Risk Assessment. He was a research associate between 1998 and 1999 at MIT. And he has a PhD in physics from ETH Zurich. Research interest spans from impacts of weather and climate on socioeconomic systems, combining numerical modeling of weather and climate risks with the engagement of decision makers and end users, with a particular focus on the treatment of uncertainty for decision making. So David will talk roughly for 25 minutes, and questions are really welcome even while David is speaking. So if you have a question, just either post it in the chat and then I will read it out loud, or preferably just for the sake of interaction, just raise your hand, or just if you don't have that functionality, put an exclamation mark in the chat, and then you will be unmuted and you can speak. In case,
the function for raising hands is hidden under reactions.
Right. Yeah, but not everybody has that. I think it depends on the version. But anyway, just write in the chat that you want to speak, and that'll be fine. So questions are welcome during the talk, but also we will have a Q&A session in the second half of this hour. And I think that's all from my side, and I'm glad to give the floor to David.
Thanks, Alessia. You hear me well like this? I hope.
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks for the kind invitation. And I basically tried to do something a bit different, as I felt they look at a lot of slides in Zoom talks, and then normally the person speaking is minusculely kind of present at the lower right. And the topic I'm covering here today is anyway more a kind of thing, a topic to embark on as a conversation. So I decided to go this way and probably share occasionally things in a chat as just now the title. So I'm going to talk about interoperability imperative in socioeconomic impact assessments. Interoperability means you can do things differently, and you can continue to do things differently, but you try to make sure you talk to each other. So it's very much in the context of interdisciplinary science, where you would say there are disciplinary bodies of knowledge you'd like to combine. And it doesn't make sense to find the meta-discipline which encompasses all. It more makes sure you basically can build bridges between these disciplines. Bridges could also be called interfaces, and an interface is only as good as the things it combines. So you need very strong bridgeheads to do so. And it becomes even more important as an imperative probably in transdisciplinary science, where often the research questions are co-developed and kind of mused about with practitioners, people who'd later like to take research forward into especially decision making. My group really operates at the interface between what we know about a system, a complex system, be it the weather and climate system, and what decision makers normally need in order to take decisions, in order to operate the system. So the decision maker's interest is much more into the system performance, while we as scientists are often more interested in system knowledge. And with the hope that it might be applied, but with the number one interest really to understand how a system functions, operates, and so on. So we tend therefore normally to rather restrain system boundaries to better understand and then gradually expand our knowledge, and therefore also the boundaries and the complexity of the systems we research into. But if you're in task with a particular role in society, be it public or private, you normally cannot do so. You cannot say, oh, we only look at that part, because you have to constantly deliver. So there is also the challenge for the decision makers on the practical side, that they cannot just arbitrarily define the system boundaries. They have to cope with basically all. Obviously, they all normally operate in a sector. They have a set of customers, clients, or people they deliver to. They have a couple of other stakeholders, like the collaborators, be it employees, be it just people involved in producing something. But they also have the wider context, which gives them the mandate. On the public side, it's normally rather a political body which gives the mandate, ultimately the constituency. On the private side, it's more the investors who probably provide the money, and with that a certain expectation. So just to set that all out, and already there, it's not the idea that the decision maker becomes a scientist, or the other way around, the scientist becomes a decision maker. It's more, again, build that bridge, figure how we could make best use of all we know about the weather and climate system in taking better, often I would say more sustainable, long-term viable decisions. And so that's a bit the challenge here. And that's why I felt it's so important to once talk a bit more about that, how that practically could be brought about. You probably know, and that was mentioned, thanks again, Alessia, for the introduction. During my career, I basically went more on the applied side, the practical side, the private sector side, namely natural catastrophe risk assessment. And already there, when I started at Swiss Re in 2000, we had this big challenge that basically models didn't talk to each other. And by no means we meant with that they have to be all the same, but you could not even import and export. You have a lot of manual steps in between. Still, to some extent, this is the case, even in that industry, and that's only one industry, and it's one where there's a big money at stake. And even there, by now, you don't have a common data standard for what you put into natural catastrophe models, and especially what to take out of it. And so when we talk about socio-economic impacts, and that's the topic here, we're not talking only about the output in terms of an expected loss. It's more, we'd like to pipe the direct physical risk we get out of an impact assessment in a narrow sense from natural catastrophe models into, say, just, for example, an input-output model which pipes that through value change, or we'd like to input that into a model which looks into business interruption and compounding effects of a particular event, and it can be much more than business interruption. I just took this example. Or it could also be you put it really in basically big economic models, general equilibrium models, where you try to figure, if you shock the global economy with natural catastrophes, climate related or not, here and there, what does that do to the equilibration of markets? And currently, sad to say, and I'm involved with my group and colleagues in a couple also Horizon 2020 projects, we mainly do that through CSV files, and we normally have lengthy Zoom calls to figure what should be in the CSV file, and that's just not professional. I mean, it just happens that way, but I sometimes look at myself and say, how could that be? 20 years into impact modeling, basically my career, and still we operate as the first day I started, when I basically picked up it was a Lotus 123 file, which was the precursor of some kind of Excel, and you had to figure what's in there and then kind of do some manual adjustment and suck it into an engine and this did some tricks, and then you got something out in yet another format. So we should go beyond that stage. I think on the NatCat modeling side, there are a couple developments in that direction. Basically, a lot of it and many tributes go to OASIS, the loss modeling framework, and the hub, where this starts to be acknowledged. So there is, and it's probably the right moment to share. Oh, first I share one thing, which is a bit of an entertaining piece. That's in one nutshell Vimeo thing to show what such an impact model looks like. And it basically also highlights that. You can look at this video. You can even find that the engine which crunches the number, that's the Climata open platform behind. But if you want now as a user to take the result of that animation to do further processing, you have to get in touch with us. And this is Stone Age, yeah. Because it could be so easy to say, hey, there's a link to that. We're working on it, so we're building a data API, but also we're still in the processing and development stage of that. So just also to share the source of that. So the model behind that is this one. And then also in the chat, we often use these type of models in case studies, and that brings you a bit closer to the topic. So I mentioned the use of these models in natural catastrophe risk assessment, where often it has a strong business imperative for efficiency and probably even to some extent efficacy. So basically, there are initiatives doing so, even though that they haven't fully concluded, there are a couple standards out there. So I wouldn't want to talk so much about the input data standards, so data standards for hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and just in a bracket probably to say, you know, risk being the combination hazard, exposure, vulnerability. We obviously therefore need structured approaches to store your hazard, your exposure, on your vulnerability. I think on a hazard, we're probably most advanced. It's often clear you store wind footprints like Whisk has done on the webpage in a netcdf file. You can upload that one. It's georeferenced. It's pretty close to what we need, and it's well documented. But even there, still, you have the CSV files for the use in OASIS, because that's the other way to go. So basically, on the hazard side, that's the simplest one, because also it is natural science. It's normally SI units. It's relatively easy to talk about. On the exposure side, we haven't concluded so far. There are exposure data standards in the pure insurance, reinsurance world, which can capture things like houses at zip codes and houses at doorsteps, coordinates. But then you have to encode what's in there and how it is built and what it is used for. So occupancy or construction-based type of ways to characterize your exposure, and that's only the built environment. And then comes other exposures, be it social, so vulnerable groups, or it be ecosystems. And we didn't so far agree, and I think it's a big topic. We could really make progress. Would we better understand how we kind of codify exposure such that we can plug and play with things? Because the models got so complex by now that, for example, we in our group, we cannot do all the steps of that value chain on our own. We normally don't develop hazard sets. We still have sometimes to do so because they're not ready to plug and play. But this now comes about. On the exposure side, there's a couple places to start from. But again, it's not a plug and play. You download, you have a standard interface, and you can build on. You basically have first to understand what's in there. How is it stored? How we can possibly access it? One of the reasons we moved from MATLAB to Python on the modeling platform was because Python provides a lot of, for example, in GeoPanda's way, to digest and suck in data, so you don't have to deal with all of that. But again, there also is a need to think about how we better codify exposure in an open fashion so we can build on and don't have to start almost from the scratch or the start each time. On the risk data, there is an approach which is called, I also put it in the chat, the risk data library. It's a very laudable effort. It hasn't been concluded. So if you go and browse on it, you normally get to missing pages still. But I think that's in its making. And the challenge is probably a bit more how we consolidate some of these initiatives. There is also, and that's the one I already referred to before, on the OASIS side, the open data standard. again, this is mainly geared towards the standard application of impact models in the natural catastrophe risk assessment space. What we are doing a lot, and that was the link I put in on this research on the case studies.html, we often use these models, as I mentioned before, in a much wider context. So not to just come up with a price tag on risk as in insurance, or with just a risk assessment in terms of a distribution of impacts, but more to figure with whom could we collaborate by linking that to the next step. So that's this, I would say, the wider understanding of impact assessments as we do in some of these Horizon projects and other endeavors. And there, it's not so much the input data standards we need, but the output data standards. And I missed one subconsciously. I didn't talk much about databases and ways to codify vulnerability. We call that impact functions for a specific reason, as vulnerability in social sciences is something completely different is meant with that. It's really often the inability of groups to deal with calamities, and that's a very relevant topic. But in the natural catastrophe modeling, where the vulnerability is normally the functional relationship between the intensity of a hazard, say the wind speed at a specific place, and the damage that inflicts on a building. And so you see this narrow understanding, or narrower, clear and specific definition of vulnerability for the use in assessing building damage does by no means pay tribute to the richness of the concept of vulnerability when it comes to of communities wrestling with the world around them. And that's why we resorted to call that impact functions, but it's just to try to give it a name which does kind of sort out this challenge. So, but on the impact function side, also, I think the risk data library starts on that, but we're not yet there. And as you know, all these models, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, must be kind of in sync, and they normally aren't. So if you change the way you model, I'd stick to the wind example quickly here. Wind as a gust of a certain kind, if it's the 1 minute gust or the 10-minute gust, is it peak gust or is it whatever? This has a lot of impacts, and what your horizontal axis on the impact function, now this relation hazard and impact really looks like. And so plug and play will still not be that trivial, but at least would the data formats be compatible, we could at least get that off our shoulder and focus on content. So that was more the comments on hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, if I use this wider context, and how we codify that. We're not there, but I think we should work more on that. And then we come to the next step, which is the really core of the intervention here, may I say, of myself, is that the outputs. There is an event loss table from Oasis. Obviously, our model creates something like that. We call it an impacts object because we do that in Python. And it also has, again, a table in it with each event and its impact. And it can be the number of affected people given a certain type of flood event, either geographically explicit, so with basically places and the number of modeled impacts, or it can be summed up by event and so on. And I think, to my knowledge at least, there's not yet any attempt to standardize the output of event-based probabilistic models. And I would say there are at least 3 regions I could see tremendous opportunities for building on that. The number one is still the core insurance risk transfer world, where forecast-based finance, index-based cover, and so on could tremendously benefit. Would these things be more plug and play? So you could say, I run the Oasis model, I run a commercial vendor model, and I run yet another thing I just have access to, and like to compare the outputs. We can always compare the figures. We can plot an exceedance probability curve. We can look at a 1 in 100 event and compare those. But sometimes it would be nice, especially if you think about the multi-model ensemble. That's where you probably want to get to in order to kind of trace or basically to harness the richness of these different approaches. Then it's a lot of number crunching, gets very nitty-gritty, and it would really benefit had we a way to talk about these things. And it's not trivial, but it's also not really rocket science, because you could say probably what you need to know is the event. You need to know the place, if it's by place or aggregated, and you probably want to have a description again of what exposure and what vulnerability went into that. And then you can dissect this type of output. So conceptually, I think we could write it down. And then once we're beyond the standard application of that output, as I said, in general risk pricing was probably a bit of a special gist to impact-based finance, because that often involves NGOs and users of these models, which are not yet so close to that sometimes, and the index insurance type of piece, which again has a strong link to development finance and the climate finance conversation. There are two other things. It's basically the impact assessment, as I sketched out at the beginning, when you try to combine these models with on direct physical impact with indirect impacts, with business interruption, kind of delays and disruptions in value chains, and ultimately the link of these models with basically the more comprehensive economic assessment, where you start to rebalance supply and demand given these shocks. And on these endeavors currently, it's really figuring what the CSV file or just a plain text should contain, and then building it from there. And that we probably there have a bit of an opportunity that's a relatively infant, or the field in its infancy. So it might be the right moment there to say, could we not propose a way how we communicate the output of impact models along the chain? And the last one, yeah, Alessio, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We got a question in the chat. Do you want to take it now, or?
And I watched it. I'm going to finish my third application area, and then I'm reading the question you said. Thanks for that. With just about time-wise, it comes closely. But the third area is also a field which is now fast developing, and that's impact-based warnings. Just a bit of background: a lot of warning happens on hazard basis. So you just warn tomorrow there will be that kind of a wind speed, that this amount of precipitation, probably is a probability, but still hazard based. So you warn in physical terms. And then is impact oriented warnings, where you basically convert that into warning levels, or normally employing a threshold and say, oh, below a certain threshold, you don't have to say anything. And warning level 3 means you have to really start thinking whether you should do this or that. And these warning levels normally come with a static codification that you can look it up and say, warning level means you should not go running in a forest if this is a warning level 3 wind warning, something like that. But still, you as a user, as a decision maker now, and I made a practical personal example, you have to translate that warning level, whether it matters to you and to what extent. And then comes impact-based warning, where you basically would provide with the warning an impact. So you would not say anymore in wind speed on warning levels, you would say, this is likely to cause that kind of people being for example, delayed in the commute, because the system will be under pressure given a certain, for example, weather event. So you need for that, first, the exposure. You need to know where the things are that might be affected, and you need to know the vulnerability, how they might react to something like that. Yet, again, this is a typical application of an impact model, as it's called, impact-based warning. And for that, again, currently they are stitched together, and some of the output of those models should then be, that's why I'm so much on the output side of impact models, the output should then get into decision support systems of both governmental agencies, being the police, civil protection, or be it in the private sector, where then people probably even build business models on those. And would we define these interfaces early on, we have much higher a chance that these impact-based warnings really provide value to society, both in the public and the private space. And it's interesting to see that some of the public actors have very elaborate systems to allocate their scarce resources, such that a fire brigade or just in general civil protection agency normally has a tracing system. They know where all their vehicles are, how they are staffed. They even know about the conditions under which they operate or where they are. And so it would be relatively straightforward to bring in that information into such a system. But currently they're built one after the other and they don't build on each other. So these would be the three areas I would say. Standard is the risk assessment, as we often talk about when we talk about risk transfer and the insurance and the finance world. The second one is really the impact assessment, more on the general scientific and economic understanding of complex systems. And the third one is this impact-based, more emergency service, kind of also a part of it, or say civil protection in general, where we would benefit a lot from harmonization of the interfaces, but not of the models. Because before, and then I come to the question, you know, I think the fact that we do have different models is in fact a strength, because there's tremendous model uncertainty if you only apply one model, and you can possibly reduce it or at least make it much more transparent by employing more than one model. And the biggest impediment to using more than one model is normally interoperability, because could you just plug and play and give it a try in model B, you probably would even be interested to do so. But currently it means you have almost to kind of set it up again. And that's why you then start to stick to your model and be losing out on that breadth. So much just for my introductory kind of a bit of a framing of that conversation. And I have a quick chat to the view to the chat where Sophie Hatton said, would a coordinated sort of effort along the lines of CMIP for impact modeling, where you have very prescribed outputs from the global climate models prescribed? Exactly. So that's still more to the hazard side of things. And there is EasyMIP. And EasyMIP tries exactly to do that, to say, we take the CMIP runs, we basically give those runs in a coordinated fashion to impact modeling communities of different kinds, be it agriculture, be it infrastructure, be it ecosystems, and so on. And they do run their first order impact models, for example, a flood model, they employ the Gamma flood model, and then convert CMIP 6 precipitation, often if it's available runoffs, into flood heights. And that's then an input into, for example, a natural catastrophe model. And I think on the pure hazard side, these things start, oh, thanks for sharing the link. These things are pretty advanced already. And one thing which is absolutely crucial, the EasyMIP data is available free, most of it. And normally that means not only for research purposes, but also for true application. So you can also build a business type of an application. For example, we're involved in the NGFS, and that's the network for greening the financial system. So it's an approach to make sure our financial system becomes over time climate resilient and does support what we basically put on the table in Paris, to make sure that climate and finance, they do talk to each other and go in sync and not against each other. A big effort. And in that one, for example, we would like to provide banks and other financial operators with key information to better manage climate risks in their portfolios. And the first step was to use EasyMIP data, but we could only do so because it comes with a license which allows the banks to build on it. And that was often a bit of an issue too. So yes, I think it's exactly the same vein that you would think about how could we now codify output of impact models such that people can build on and take it forward and further. I'm fully aware that this is normally leading to the next level of a conversation. So we'll then not have any more a conversation about what's the column 3 in my CSV file. But definitely the content will still be up for debate. But that's much more informed debate, and the debate which, in my view at least, creates more value than fiddling with the numbers themselves. And especially if we would arrive at a point where you can plug and play with one or two different sorts of these kind of inputs in the next step of modeling, you could also a bit stress test your approach, whether it works under different conditions. So that's what I wanted to share a bit. So this idea that while elements of interoperability exist by now in the natural catastrophe world, it took us almost 20 years, if I look back, the first models being developed in the mid 90s. and then the first attempts to standardize inputs with Cresta and Accor in the around the 2000s, and now with Oasis being really the first one where you have a platform you can download and play with in the insurance world. And that's probably the thing to take it forward. And there's a couple bodies, probably just to quickly mention the Insurance Development Forum, also what's done by basically the colleagues in the Insurance Resilience Solutions Fund and so on. They all have that kind of goal in mind, that these things should talk to each other, such that we can then, based on models talking to each other, have a more better informed conversation among ourselves. So that's what I wanted just to throw in here and see how it flies and how you react, how we might want to take it forward. Not that I would have a blueprint. The only thing to conclude, in our own group, we currently build a data API. We make sure it's HDF5, so that also an Oasis model can build on and so on. So the interoperability, at least there, we take it into our design, but that's only a starting point. And with that, thanks for your attention and open for a bit of a conversation.
Thanks a lot, David. Thank you very much for this very, let's say, practical oriented presentation, and which I think it's one of the things we need the most because this endless research needs to end up somewhere in a fruitful way. Now the floor is open for questions. As I said before, either post in the chat or just indicate that you want to speak. In the meantime, that we wait for people to react, I do have a couple of questions. I start with I think the easy one, I guess. So we saw that there are some examples of this, right? Oasis is stepping in that direction. Also, EasyMIP is one of these examples. But at the same time, we are quite far from reaching the target in which everything is fully compatible and we have a nice workflow and data formats are shared across actors and stakeholders. I wonder whether to reach that target, it's just a matter of time. So we are okay as we are. So it's just a matter of, pushing it in a collaborative sense, and in 5-10 years time we will be there. Or do we need a more sort of, regulatory requirements in terms of data formats in order to push all actors to comply with those data formats? And if we don't have that, then that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, that's exactly what you're wrestling with. I think nothing is going to happen if people are not craving for it. And we probably got to this stage where it starts to hurt. And we know it from our work in Receipt, where we spend too much time figuring how to exchange the CSV file. I stop now talking and pickering on the CSV file. But that's because that's where we are. And we all agree we could do better. So that's the starting point. And I think then the other thing that people moving is a shared vision. And we're definitely getting closer. I think we have now, to quite some extent, one on, as I mentioned, hazard exposure vulnerability. That starts now to fall into place. Not so much yet on the output side. That's very much this direction also to take into account. And I think what's not working is the stick approach here. It is the carrot approach. We're especially this community here, we're researchers, and I think if it's too narrowly defined, we might curtail ourselves in developing, innovating, fascinating things. So it's definitely, it has to be an open standard and approach. It can also be, we say we start with the basics and we build it on that from there, because also that one would get a lot out of our way. But it's not the idea that we would have a polished, fully fledged thing and you can only share if you comply. I would find this kind of very, very not to my liking, to say the least. But I think it's more to sort out this common basis and build on that one. And as I sketched, I think there are elements, especially on the output side of most of these models, we could kind of agree to at least get that out of our way. That's probably the way forward. And I could imagine that we've seen that a bit in also the close proximity of cascades and receipts. That's just to take two programs I'm involved in, that there these conversations started. So it's something which is imminent, but will probably be nice to speed it up a little bit. And not that I would now ask for each proposal have yet another form to fill in. How you do that? It's more to, that's why I said it's this craving for a solution. Probably we need more to support that people say, oh, hey, it's there, we use it, rather than I'm forced to. So that's a bit more the approach. There's another one in the chat. I have to quickly, carefully read it. As this is on the lower side of my screen, I should rearrange my screen.
Unless, Thomas, you want to post it yourself as you wish.
Oh yeah, Thomas, please go ahead. That's probably better. Yeah.
Yeah, sure, I can. I hope you can hear me well. So maybe first of all, my name is Thomas Remke. I'm working at the Climate Service Center Germany, and I'm actually working as a scientist in a large Helmholtz initiative on climate adaptation. So I'm a climate modeler and working at the interface providing climate information for impact modeling. And I really liked your insights and thoughts on the data formats and how to transfer data. And within the distillation process of more hierarchical data to, let's say, lower level hierarchical data. So what would you recommend in the end? Because I, from my experience, the mass majority is using more low-level data, of course, because it's much easier to use. But the ideally setup would be a hierarchical data set, which can be condensed to, let's say, a lower-level data set. And you also mentioned Python. So what is your experience in making hierarchical data fit for purpose for an end user, which is more used to a low-level data format?
Oh, thanks for that question. I mean, this is often at the core of when you then engage with stakeholders. Sometimes all they need is a conversation. They need a person to talk to, basically a phone number to dial, not more than that. And that's the best you can often provide. And then developing on that one. And then the next step is often more the type of report that is something you can read plain language. And it's a few numbers, and some are used in policymaking in terms of kind of stating the need or stating an opportunity to move. That's what we've done a lot in our economics of climate adaptation studies, where we figured our target audience is the finance minister, and they like cost curves. You might not like cost curves, and there are reasons not to like them, especially as they often are pretty myopic in a sense. They focus on net present value calculations often, and they hide a lot, but often it was the discussion starter. So they were not comfortable anymore with just somebody saying it's an issue. They wanted to have it on the table and actionable in their sense. And then through the conversation, you add the value to say, aha, this is not the end of the story. You should not implement these measures along the cost curve without asking. This is now the basis for the next dialogue, especially with those being either affected or in charge of executing some of them. And for that step, you started some saying, oh, we have a GIS system. We'd like to get this spatially explicit. So then we prepared some of the results as GIS shapefiles. And so it depends, there's no rule to it. And I think what's always good is to be able to cater for these different needs. So that's the reason why I alluded to that before. If you store it in a form on the output side of say your model, which is versatile, you can do the sum of everything, and out comes the ultimate number. It will be 42, I know. And then basically we don't know the question to it. Or it could be a bit more precise. Some people might want 1 in 100 impact on a particular infrastructure you probably can produce. Or somebody would say, I'd like to get it spatially not so highly explicit, but I'd like to have it by, for example, affected type of infrastructure. Or another person would say, I'd like to see the split between storm and surge damage rather than the sum of it, because my interventions are so different. And that's what probably I had in mind, saying that, as I say, it has to ultimately be hierarchical, but it would be nice if you can, how to say that, if you can condense these dimensions occasionally. And somebody might say, aha, now, as I have the number split between wet and dry impacts, for example, just to make it very general here. Now I would like to get the dry ones spatially explicit, because I learned they're the biggest chunk. And for those, I'm now thinking about storm barriers, and they are in space. And for the dry part, it might be building codes. And building codes you don't normally do by street address. You normally say all must be built properly. I just paraphrase here. And so for the building code policymaking, you might not need a high spatial resolution, because it's more, as I said, in this direction of of building standards. And so there I see how these interfaces could play.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Are there more questions? I had one comment and a question. Like, I'll go one from Sophie Ebden. I have a query about assessing the outputs from economic impact models. Are these developed to the same extent as the physical climate models in terms of validation and uncertainty?
Oh, thanks for that question. I'm the only person who can answer that. No, jokes aside, this completely exceeds my capability. The point is that you open this very fascinating conversation that the concept of uncertainty is normally very specific to the particular kind of group of scientists, or you could say discipline you talk to. I think then the natural catastrophe impact modeling community came to the conclusion, would we basically account for all the uncertainties in our assessments? We cannot really say tremendously precise things, right? Because there are so many vagaries in how not only models are constructed, how it could all play out. And so, but we are very high aware, there's a high level of awareness by now, especially from the climate community, where this was absolutely crucial for decision making. Is this a robust development, or is it only one option we might want to consider? We know by now it's unequivocal. It's no way around considering it. And on the economic side, I mean, often the underlying assumptions of the models need to be relatively strong, because we don't have governing equations as we have them for the move of air masses. And so often the uncertainty is modeling uncertainty. What you put in a model defines basically to a large extent, but then you can quantify within your modeling framework uncertainty, as we do in physics, obviously, and quantitative finance does a lot of that, or basically also an economic side of things. But I think one should be extremely cautious. What I realized is that while the NatCat models, they normally focus on shocks, so we try to understand when it gets really bad. And most general equilibrium models in economics, it's in a name, right? They want to equilibrate, and they're normally not dealing with shocks in as explicit as a way as it's used to be the case in the natural catastrophe, physical risk type of world. And there's a lot we have to work together to advance on that. Just sometimes by the sheer design of the models, they cannot not take these shocks on board. I remember in 2014, so prior to Paris, we did try with Standard & Poor's to shock a simplified general equilibrium model with these catastrophes. And we basically had to look at what it does to the economic output. And we basically had just factor productivity. That's one variable in some of these models. And that you could say, oh, this goes down after a natural catastrophe event because, for example, factories are not operating anymore. But then comes the counterfactual, the counterbalancing thing is that things are rebuilt. So that, say that the productivity of the building sector is going up, and also that basically the value creation of that sector. And these models can start to be able to take these things into account. Again, here, to my point, in case we provide the output of the direct impacts in a codified fashion, then the developers of the general equilibrium models, for example, or even more largely integrated assessment models, then can build on that and think, what could we do to our models to better account for, to take that forward? But that's currently exactly an emerging field, and we see it both in Receipt and Cascades that it's intellectually absolutely fascinating. That's the positive way to frame it, and the challenging way to frame it is we are not yet there, and but it's absolutely key. And basically what I said when I started at ETH, I'd like to understand the propagation of uncertainty all through the value chain. So from the change in the climate system, still probably being scenario force, so you take a reference concentration pathway and pipe it all through, what it means in terms of, and where are the biggest uncertainty coming from, and the number one insight often it is the further down the road you go, the bigger they get, because once you go beyond the physical space, people take decisions or not. They have cultural values, they have priorities, and they have other challenges, not least being COVID currently, and that could completely change the outcome. And it's such a big challenge that I'm always a bit wary of kind of putting too much on the shoulder of the dear economist friends, because they have to wrestle with human beings and their decision making, and that's not like an air parcel. So definitely, again, a reason. The more we can integrate these things in the sense of interoperability, the further we can learn about these complex systems.
Yeah, and I think interoperability is like a requirement to do a proper uncertainty analysis, right? Because you want to use maybe models coming from different sources, model vendors, and models from academia or from platforms like Oasis. And so if you don't have that interoperability in place, there is no way you cannot do such an analysis, like comparing different models.
Yeah. Thanks for that, because it hits a bit to this economic. Because in 2007 and 8, we figured these models could be applied in the adaptation space to better understand storm hitting you. What could you do about that? You could use the CAT model, the natural catastrophe impact model, not only to calculate risk, but to say, if there is something improved, like a building code, what's the benefit of that building code improvement? Not only regarding risk today, but also in a changed environment. And at the time, we did that manually. You have to imagine, you took the CAT model, you changed the impact functions or the vulnerability. Manually, you put it in a database, you press a button, you wait, comes out the result, you put it in an Excel sheet, and then you do the next thing. And if you have 5 or so measures we wanted to try, it's only 5 model runs today and 5 in the future, and to do something in between, we call that discounting and net present value calculations. But you quickly run your CAT model 20, 50, 100 times. And each time you do really read off the numbers from the screen and put them in an Excel sheet. And that was the beginning of this Climata thing, to say that CAT modeling is a function you can call many times as you want, and you store the results. And then you have a table of results. So you have not only one impact object, we have basically many of those. We'd like to compare those, and that led in that direction. And now if you want to bring that to the fore and the use of the economic modeling world, it's not one output you pipe through, it's thousands of realizations of events and possible interactions you take on the direct physical side. They like to crunch through this system, and that's where we do need a standard and agreement on the interface. Otherwise, we're not going to do it. And that's for me, it's a missed opportunity also for scientific endeavors.
Please, Lawrence.
Hi, good morning. Thanks a lot for the great presentation, and well, actually great points that you raised other than the presentation. And I wanted to come back to a bit more the technical things that you mentioned and some of the links that you indeed showed. I think this is a crucial component, because I agree that a main hindrance is actually the interoperability of data, but also code and so on. So I had a question or a point I wanted to raise and have your perspective on that. Is, for instance, the divide that still seems to be there, for instance, between the more insurance sector developments and, for instance, more the research or the developments for public policy. Because, for instance, when I look at the OASIS ideas on, for instance, exposure data, open data standards, this is very much geared to the insurance sector. What I'm missing, for instance, is public infrastructure, but also population, so health effects, mortality, morbidity, and so on. I think if we, as a community, so including both the private and public and research sectors, to move forward on open data standards, we need to have a more integrated view on what is needed. And if World Bank and research and OASIS are doing their own thing, I don't think we get this interoperability. So what is your view how to make it really more interoperable than what I see? What are good developments, but is still very much siloed in my view.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I brought it up today, because I don't have an answer to it. And interestingly, those involved, be it Dicky Whittaker or the colleagues of the World Bank, they're very open to it. It's the challenge is often we all have a mandate which basically asks us something to do and to deliver on that. And that's often harder to deliver if you take the broader view. But long term, you're going to better deliver if you account for that. So why not have an exposure standard where you can put in, as well as you can codify buildings, you can also codify vulnerable groups. There's no problem with that. Obviously, I know and I'm aware of some of the social science conversations. They say, no, you shouldn't do so. But I think you should do so being cautious and conscious about what you do about these things. And I'm completely against putting price tags on human lives. It's more to say, now keep the pertinent metric, exactly. Not only store the building and its quality, store how many people are living in there and what condition they are. And we could use the same model to get a very good first idea of what a particular calamity or event might do to these people. And I know it's easier, brick and mortar, it just falls apart, you can rebuild. And then we're in the loss and damage discussion because people may basically be severely injured, and that's a loss, that's not a damage. But still, I think this model would provide value in these conversations. And I do see, reading into OASIS, I think there is openness for it. So I think there definitely, we had always this problem also that you probably, I think we call the models often the thing exposure. And to some people, for me, it's clear this can be buildings and people, younger and older, and whoever it might be. And it can be other things. It can be mangroves that are basically exposed ecosystems. And so often the pure technical basis would be able to accommodate for. And it's often then that this level of what you put in where we're still a bit limited. But I think that's on the exposure side, we're probably getting there. The next challenge is then the impact functions, as they're already very hard for buildings to establish. It's not a secret that even the most advanced do guess around some of the shapes, and we definitely do so too. On the social vulnerability side, this is an order of magnitude more complex, but it can be tracked. I mean, sometimes the work I've done with Tobias Geiger just saying at a certain wind speed, it's just serious. And you could just count the number of people in a region that are exposed to this serious wind speed. And that's often a very relevant information. And you don't say how badly they're insured or whether they die. You just say at this wind speed in a community, you just not sit casually and don't feel it. And that element we probably could early bring in and then build on that one. Yeah. I would say, to conclude, often the technical structures do accommodate, they allow us to accommodate for these things. What I have to say, what I would tremendously, now comes a wish list, right? They would tremendously benefit as a group. We still have to construct too much of our own. For example, SSP-based exposures, so in sync with the IPCC on a spatially explicit basis, and if you're about wishes, then it means sectorially specific, spatially explicit on high resolution. It would be tremendous. We could do so much more things. And we currently reinvent these things. and my group knows me. Sometimes I'm a bit the pragmatist here, and then you could do better. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity, especially people-based exposure. We could quickly do a lot, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
We got a couple more questions, and also Edward raised his hand. So I think we go in the chat first. Perhaps, Sophie Ebden, perhaps if the main funders of the projects in the different silos were brought together, they could stipulate agreeing to open data standards if the communities can first agree the standards.
That's extremely well formulated. What I meant is that it has to come from the community, and I'd like the carrot approach. So if we say, hey, you're with us, and please make sure the things we share there are of a form we can talk to each other, more than somebody would say, that's now how you have to codify. So very much in that direction. So we as a community have a certain obligation to bring that forward and to propose say the building blocks of such a thing, and then for example other funding agencies, they can refer to and say, hey, if you do it like today, you have to put a DOI on things, you have to basically make your data available, and that's a very important piece in it. But the next step is now what the how, right? Not just what you make available, exactly how you make it available becomes more important, and that should play to this interoperability theme very much so.
Then we got another question from John Kropf. If we go interoperable, should we also go beyond climate risk and try to interoperate with, for instance, biodiversity loss modeling, water scarcity, hunger from overfarming, overarming, etc., etc.?
John, I think we should have this ambition level as a community. That we went beyond buildings, which I think is a tremendous step forward. But you have to start somewhere. I mean, if you start with the flabbergasting stuff, you're probably not getting it done. But I think so. Yeah, I worked quite a lot with the Nature Conservancy on ecosystem services in adaptation, but also on impacts on ecosystem services, because they cannot deliver their service, and I mean with service not necessarily monetary outcome, but I mean basically you could say the beauty of the creation. Sorry, sometimes you have to make reference to these terms to basically make sure the environment we're living in is the one we want to live in. And I think these models can do a lot to say, hey, with these type of interventions again, so I'm very much come from this decision-making point to say, could we use these models to devise about better for example, conservation strategies? Now, the problem you probably know in the conservation areas of the Nature Conservancy, for example, the term conservation is probably not paying full tribute to the transformation we need, but it's all meant in good intent. But it's probably more than conservation, it's probably more curation of nature. And to some extent, you ask, what's the role of the humans in that? And probably we should rather learn something than try to impose. But I think in this context, these models can be of tremendous value. And again, technically, looking at the building blocks, they're far from perfect. But I think we could contribute to these things. And my proof point of it is when we've done the economics of climate adaptation study for New York after Sandy. It was a mandate from Bloomberg at the time. We basically look at oyster reefs, for example, in the Hudson River, and they're back there. You cannot eat them, but they do really both filter the water, and their surface is very fractal, so it's much more than two-dimensional, and they dissipate a lot of wave energy. And we've seen that the value of basically putting the natural ecosystem back, or parts of it, with this double benefit. It has a risk reduction component that was probably the trigger to think about, but it also had a, may I say the word again, restoration component also to the ecosystem. And there we did that exactly using these impact models with the city planning office. And that's also a bit of a generational issue that younger colleagues there who do think, hey, why not from the start take that into account and not at the end as a cream on a cake. It's probably the other way around. The cake we're living from is what we currently threaten, and not the cream on it. So thanks for that. Yes.
And now, Edward, please.
Thanks, David. Yeah, very interesting, and maybe you've heard what I'll say, but I mean, completely agree what you're saying about the data formats. And just for perhaps those of you that don't know, I mean, you're completely right. There's huge amounts of value in this. And for Working Group 1 in IPCC and CMIP, obviously everyone knows they're all working with very standardized, structured data in net CDFs, and all variables and things and units are always consistent. And on the other end, if you look to kind of Working Group 3, then for probably over a decade, integrated assessment models through the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium have been doing something similar. And it's much simpler. It's still an Excel file format, but I think this also has shown many benefits recently due to its simplicity, in that really brings more people into the community. And so I can say for Working Group 3 AR6, we have more than 100 different models submitting data on emissions and energy and building sector scenarios, partly because the barrier is low to contributing data. So neither of these may be your solution, and perhaps you also want to do with shape files. Maybe you probably want to have tabular data and NetCDF data, and maybe other spatial types, or if you're doing HDF5. But certainly, I'm sure other communities happy to also discuss how they've gone about it to help you take this forwards. And I think would be hugely valuable for Working Group 2, and also for linking assessments between, let's say, these 3 working groups within IPCC, but also broader research community.
Now, thanks for this comment. It just triggers a reaction, short one. Like can IPCC like physical basis, Working Group 1, then it gets super spread out in all dimensions of impacts in Working Group 2, so to say. And Working Group C has, since a lot of these debates are held in monetary terms, it has then there a big benefit. Ultimately, most of it goes into economic terms. And that's probably why, and I fully understand why, for the Working Group 2 part of the story, it's the most challenging to come up with a CMIP type of a registry. But even there, at least it's for quite some parts, it's there, it's possible, and EasyMIP goes in that direction. So the elements are coming together. Yeah, it's not that I would have claimed here to be the first one to spot the problem, right? It's more to again provide reasons for why we should convene, and probably also how to say over time converge on these topics. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, David. I think we should close now. It's 4 minutes past 12. I'd like to thank you, David, again for the talk and for the discussion which followed, and thanks everybody for listening in. Yeah, and I wish you all a good day, good afternoon, depending where you are. Thanks.